All right, well, so let's drive to the area that I think more concerns me, and it is the area we've disagreed about in the past, which is the status of things like values and claims of right and wrong and good and evil, the ethics in the natural order. You have made much of this notion that you derived from Hume, that you can't get an ought from an is. But perhaps you prop that up. Like I, in the past, in my book, The Moral Landscape, and I think it was the TED talk I gave that you reacted to way back when, it was 2010. I claim to...
Oh my God, was it 2010? Really?
2010, yes. That's how quickly time flies. Right. So I claim that you can make ultimately rigorous scientific claims about right and wrong and good and evil. And I was arguing for a kind of what I would call a moral realism, which is to say that there are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures, which can serve everything we could conceivably mean by right and wrong and good and evil. And these are naturalistic facts, and you can be right and wrong about them. And realism, in this sense, is the fact that there is a reality, whether you understand it or not. Your claims about it can be more or less right or wrong. It's possible not to know what you're missing. And I extend that to the domain of questions of value, right? And you are a fan of Hume's parsing of this matter, so perhaps give me the reasons why not from the Hume side, and then we can...
Sure. I think that there's two slightly different claims. One would be the claim that you can derive ought from is, which I think is just manifestly wrong. That's just logically wrong, right? By the rules of logic, garbage in, garbage out. Values in, values out, facts in, facts out. By using the rules of deductive logic, you cannot derive conclusions about properties that did not somehow appear in the axioms or the premises from which you did your logic. So I think that's just a non-starter. Now,
so just to unpack that a little more. So yeah. Hume's claim was that there's no description of the way the world is. There's no factual description of the universe which can tell you how it ought to be or how you should act within it, right? So it's the oughts and shoulds get smuggled in. You have to add something that you want. You have to add a goal, say, and then on your account, science can tell you how to reach that goal. But the goal is something that the value-laden goal is something that you are smuggling in.
That's right. So Hume, I feel bad because late in life, I realized that Hume should have been my hero all along. One of the very few shortcomings of my philosophical undergraduate education was that I was at a Catholic university and Hume was the bad guy. Yeah. So I didn't realize until much later that Hume was the good guy. However, bless his heart, he was not the clearest writer all the time. And he was the clearest thinker, but he was also mischievous. So he would make his points via dialogue or sarcasm or jokes. And the is and ought analysis is exactly that. It's not his most definitive, careful, logical piece of writing, because basically he's making fun of people who he thinks are making this mistake. He says, I'm reading people writing about what is true and is true, and that's what he was aiming at. And then suddenly it's about what ought to be true, and it didn't come from anywhere. And so he kind of implies that you can't do it. And so I think that's right. I think that the conclusion, in that case, I would believe the strong conclusion, namely that in order to derive conclusions about what ought to be true or what should be true or what is morally right, we have to include in our theory an assumption or an axiom that relates to values, that relates to what is good and what ought to do. I think that is a straightforward computational science claim, that you can't do the logic from there. Now, even if you believe that claim, which everyone should believe, you could still argue about moral realism versus anti-realism. It's totally possible to be a moral realist and a moral objectivist and still admit that you can't derive ought from is.
Yeah, so I've always viewed that little bit of Hume, and again, it is kind of an aside. It's not something he argues for at length, and yet people have made much of it in philosophy and in science. I viewed it as a kind of semantic trick which need not confine our thinking about these things. It's a little bit like Zeno's paradox. Zeno says, in order for an arrow to hit its target, it must move halfway to the target and then halfway again, and ergo it never arrives. But of course, arrows don't have to fly that way. Arrows can just fly all the way to the target. And if you want to if you need mathematics where you sum the infinite series, or you do find some way of nullifying that argument, fine. But it's set up as and it took hundreds of years for people to figure out why it's wrong, but it's an unnatural constraint imposed by, in that case, just the geometry of the situation. In Hume's case, it's just the meaning we're giving words like ought and should versus is. Now, I think, the other way to come at it from my point of view is you can give up all notion of ought and should. Let's say we're in the universe and there is no ought or should, or let's discover the oughts and shoulds. I mean, one question I have, which doesn't originate with me, I think many people have posed it this way, but if all the facts, if all the is claims in the universe aren't enough to give you some guidance as to how you ought to live, just what could give you that guidance, right? I mean, we're talking about the totality
That's in my
of all facts.
book.
Yes, yeah. So I think Dan Dennett has made this point, and others have. So that's worth wondering, right? It's like what extra piece would you be hoping for? But let's say there's no such thing as ought or should, or let's start there. It seems pretty clear to me that the ground truth of our circumstance as conscious beings is first consciousness. The something seems to be happening, where there's an experiential character to this place. And this experience admits of a range of possibilities that we have all dimly discovered parts of this range. We have had excruciating experiences and sublimely happy experiences, and we are trying to navigate toward the latter and away from the former, and helplessly trying. It's like the values come in. Put your hand on a hot stove, you will discover your value to get your hand off of it very early. You don't have to be reasoned into it. This is as incontrovertible as anything you can experience. So there's certain things that you will just want to avoid. And so to take a more abstract picture, there is consciousness. There's the totality of actual and possible conscious minds that are open to this range of conscious experience. And the only thing I think I need to be a moral realist, and for science ultimately to be the framework in which we talk about right and wrong and good and evil, is to concede that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, right? If we should avoid anything, if we should do anything, we should get away from the worst possible misery for everyone. Every other state of the universe is better than that. If words like good and bad and better and worse are going to mean anything ever, having every possible conscious mind suffer as much as it possibly can for as long as it can, to no good end, there's no silver lining, there's no lessons learned, this is just hell, right? That's bad and worth avoiding. And the answers as to how the minds involved would avoid this state are all ultimately scientific. In our case, we're talking about everything from genes on up to economic systems. We're talking about neurochemistry, we're talking about psychology, sociology, politics, whatever fact-based discussion we can have about how creatures like ourselves can flourish. That, and again, you and I may define science slightly differently. I'm not talking about narrowly operationalized lab-coded science, or I'm not talking about the equations we can write now to describe these systems. I'm not talking about data we necessarily can get right now with the machines available, but a fact-based discussion about all of the variables that spell the difference between excruciating and pointless misery on the one hand and sublimely creative, beautiful, joyful, as good as it gets conscious states on the other. And again, we don't know how far the horizons go in both directions. And this is why this is realism. Undoubtedly, there are horizons of conscious experience that we will never even imagine exist, but are possible for minds very different from our own. And we may one day build the artificial intelligences that experience those states, if in fact we build conscious machines. So all of this is a discussion about facts, actual facts and possible facts, known and unknown, that relate to the conscious experience of conscious beings. And it captures every possibility of suffering and happiness within it, because these are natural phenomena. We're told consciousness is a natural phenomenon, and its contents must be natural phenomena. And if you can't find your morality and your claims of good and evil and right and wrong and better and worse there's nowhere else to find them. This is the space in which things can possibly matter. This is where values can be found. That's why I put, ultimately, whether we can in practice in any given moment do this, ultimately the questions of value fall within that naturalistic paradigm. Previous conversations between us online suggest that you demur there and we disagree, but I'm not sure whether we've just been hung up on the meanings of words and the consequences of Hume, or if you actually disagree there.
Well, there's a little bit of gliding back and forth between what we call ethical questions and meta-ethical questions, right? Ethical questions on how we actually, what is right and wrong, what should we do, what is moral, and the meta-ethical questions on how do we set up a system for deciding what is ethical and so forth. So you seem to say that there is a principle that we should avoid maximal suffering for conscious creatures. So do we agree that you are not deriving that principle from what is? That's an extra little bit of axiom?
Well, no, I would say that like every other scientific discipline, a science of value in this sense does have to pull itself up by its bootstraps with some axiom. So, physics has axioms like the value of understanding the world in a logically coherent way, or even in a way that doesn't seem logically coherent, but is incoherent by some other logic that we can't intuit, right? So as is the case with quantum mechanics. So there's some brute fact of epistemology. There's some yank of the bootstraps that has to get your inquiry started. And I actually can find nothing more fundamental from my point of view than the fact of consciousness, the fact that something seems to be happening. I mean, this is compatible with us being confused about everything else, right? This could be a simulation. We're in the matrix. We're a brain in a vat. This is a dream. I'm the only one who exists. All of that's possible. I could be radically confused, mistaken about everything. And yet, the one thing I can't be confused about, the one thing that can't be an illusion, is that something seems to be happening. And that's what I'm calling consciousness. And then the only other axiom to add is that there is a difference between the worst possible state of consciousness and the best, insofar as those can be discovered. If anything matters, that difference matters. That's where ethics come in. And so the reason why the metaethics, the only relevant metaethics here, and the metaethics is, the metaethical doubt you could introduce here is, and people do this, but I can't believe they mean what they think they mean. They'll say things like, well, who's to say that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad? Right? Like, so where can you stand so as to form that doubt? Like, again, I'll just take you to a hot stove and let's have this conversation, right? Like, there's something more fundamental than the intuition you think you have that can motivate that doubt, right?
So, of course, science requires assumptions to get off the ground. The basic intelligibility of the world, some rough correspondence of our sensory data with things that happen, and so forth. Morality or ethics also require assumptions to get off the ground. The point is that the assumptions you need to get morality off the ground are not a subset of the ones you need to get science off the ground. You're introducing a new assumption, that we should avoid the maximum pain for conscious creatures. So
how is that an assumption that is any less fundamental?
I didn't say it was.
Okay.
It's just not science.
But it's not science to say we should understand the world either. That's an ought that you smuggle in order to motivate science.
No.
But it's not medicine to say that you should cure disease. It's just once you agree that you should cure disease, you can have a science of medicine.
Right. But the things we learn by doing science, let's put it this way. Think about possible worlds, right? The philosopher David Lewis liked to talk in these terms. Imagine all the different ways the world could be. One way to think about what science does is to say, there's all these different ways the world could be. Let's go look at it and figure which one it is. So the universe could be expanding. It could be contracting. We don't know. We need to go look at it. That's how we learn what is, by making these observations. Your principle that we should avoid the maximum suffering for conscious creatures is not learned that way.
Well, so I think we're getting hung up on the charged nature of this word should. Let's just say there is no should, and yet there are all of these experiences on offer. And you, from the core of your being as a conscious being, will prefer some states over others. That is a fact. That is a fact about you.
Yes.
That is part of the is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And science can understand that ultimately.
Yes.
Right. And what we have, therefore, is this navigation problem. You care whether you burn in fire for eternity.
I do.
And it's in the nature. And if there is a state where that happens, science subsumes that fact.
Right?
Right? And if there's a way to avoid that, some completed science subsumes that fact.
Yes.
And so in my view, these claims about what's possible for conscious minds captures everything we could conceivably care about.
But you, for some reason, which I'm a little confused about,
Should to this picture.
you
The navigation
do.
problem still exists. No,
I don't. It is a should claim. There are things that will happen in the world. There are different ways that things could happen, and they would be associated with different levels of suffering. And that's it. And we stop, right? If all we're doing is science, we're describing what happens in the world or what could happen, and we stop. But to do anything about morality is necessarily a set of statements about what we ought to do, what should happen, what is right and wrong.
Well, no,
And all you
it
need to
could
do
it
is
could just-
admit one more axiom that we should avoid the greatest suffering, and we can't derive it from what is, and then we can stop talking about metaethics and talk about ethics.
First of all, you're not. I don't think you're acknowledging all of the mad work done by people who think that you can't actually make universal claims, realistic claims about right and wrong, good and evil. So it's like
I didn't agree with your axiom. I just want you to admit that it's an axiom.
Well, my claim is that you can get there with just is claims about the situation we're in. We all will have this preference not to burn in fire for eternity, right?
So what?
That's of the nature of what it is to be a conscious being and the difference between burning in fire and not, right? And there are right answers with respect to how to avoid that. So this is just a description of the situation.
Do I want to avoid it?
Yeah.
Should I?
No, but you want to avoid it, and there's a way to avoid it.
Should I avoid it? Should you avoid it? Should I make other people avoid it?
But the should is derivable from the feeling of how bad it is to be in fire for eternity.
If we assume that we should avoid the feeling of being in fire for all eternity.
But what I'm saying is that the claim, the question, the place that it seems
would be
like
very liberating for you to just say, yes, we should assume that.
well, but I just don't see there's no alternative. Well, like if you actually,
if there's no alternative, then we should certainly do it.
But it's not even an operation. That's what I'm saying. If there's no alternative, the gesture it can't even be made. So if you're actually tracking what is meant by the words, the worst possible misery for everyone, there's no place to stand where you could say, well, should we really avoid that? Maybe we have other priorities. Maybe there's something more important than avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone.
You really don't want to just admit. I mean, I could certainly imagine all sorts of alternative axioms.
Imagine another priority.
We should maximize the suffering of conscious creatures.
But who are we? Who are we in that case? We are among the conscious creatures.
Yeah, we should. Yeah. Again, I'm not that there's an ethical question about whether or not this is the right axiom to choose. But there is a perfectly transparent, logical question about do we need such an axiom?
Well, no, I think it's interesting. I mean, this is one of these conversations where, at some level, all you can appeal to are your intuitions about the kind of meanings of words, like should or what it means to embrace an axiom.
I disagree. I think that, and again, the example I do in the book came from John Searle, who I picked on a lot. But he did the same kind of thing you're doing, the same kind of thing I would argue David Hume was arguing against. He said he wrote a paper entitled How to Derive Ought from Is. And he started with something like, I say a certain sentence, a clear is statement. And then he just sort of translated that sentence very gradually. And at the end, he said, I ought to act this way.
I agree that Searle's maneuver there smuggled in but he was playing by Hume's rules, right? I think there's something more fundamental than the rules Hume set up. That's what I'm trying to get at.
For whatever reason you are reluctant to admit that you are assuming that we should not maximize the suffering of conscious creatures, then all you can do is say, here are some things that could happen, and here is the suffering that would be attached to them.
But to say that is to pretend to stand somewhere outside that system where there's nothing else that could conceivably matter more than the thing you're describing, right? So like the mattering comes in. The mattering is not a layer you apply to it after the fact.
You certainly don't want to take the epistemological stance that what should and should not happen is really just achievable by definition. I think there is substance to choosing between different standpoints from which to get morality. And I think that this is the reason why this conversation is sort of, I mean, it's an important conversation to have. I'm all in favor of having it. But it's frustrating because it's 5% of the conversation we should have. Because if we could admit that one makes an assumption to get morality off the ground, just like one makes science assumptions.
I've always admitted that, in the sense that is every scientific enterprise, every foundational enterprise does have this brute fact, pull yourself by the bootstraps maneuver. And the thing I've always been railing against is this apparent double standard where people ask of a universal morality something they would never ask of physics. Physics isn't self-justifying.
No, they don't. They're really not.
Well,
they're just
they
pointing out
because I've
that
been on the other side of those conversations.
They're pointing out that this extra thing you need is not subsumed within the things you already have. This extra axiom to get morality off the ground is not one of the axioms we need to get science off the ground. Admit it, it's okay. You'll be happier. You should do it.
Yes, good point.
Minimize the suffering of these.
I would agree with you that all the interesting work of ethics is yet to be done once you admit this. So the reason why, in my view, there's a landscape of possibilities here. There could be many right answers and many more wrong answers to how to live a good life, and these right answers can be incompatible. And so we could have we could have genuine disagreements about what a good life looks like, given how we're set up culturally or psychologically. Well, I think I will leave it to the wisdom of the crowd to figure out what we agree about or disagree about there.